Alright, here's a video about Christianity. I hate to dwell on the topic, but it's interesting to me. And this video is on the topic of the historicity of the events from the New Testament, that is, the Gospels, etc. And I had made a video on this topic before on a different channel, but that channel's gone, so I figured I'd make a new one. Basically, you can sum it up in a fairly short amount of time. The Gospels were written as late as the 80s AD and only as early as the late 60s or early 70s AD. So the Gospels were written by people who were not eyewitnesses to Jesus' lifetime. They were written by people who were going on information from second, third, or fourth-hand accounts, because back then, you've got to understand, most people didn't live past 40. So the majority of the people who had actually seen Jesus would have been dead by the time that time period came about, if not all of them. As we know, most of the people associated with such people got butchered, so Christians, etc., Christians and Jews got put down big time. We know that. We know they were persecuted. There's no question of that in the historical record. But what should be questioned, and indeed theologians and historians who have studied biblical history and the theology surrounding the Christian religion have come to the conclusion, many of them have, that indeed a lot of the texts which make up the New Testament, number one, we don't know the authors of them. A lot of them, we don't know who the authors are. We don't know the dates which they were written, but they were certainly far after most of the events they record. They were probably not written by the people that they claim to have been written by, for instance, Paul never writing most of Paul's work, which is very likely. And we know that because of Rome, under Constantine and etc. at the Council of Nicaea, we know that a lot of the material in those books might be drastically different from what it once was anyway, as early Christian, what we would call Gnostic writings, were destroyed, as the Arians were persecuted, Arian with an I, not a Y, and as various different groups were put down by Rome, which had always incorporated religion and state politics together. So what happened is that when Rome adopted Christianity, it became a state religion, and so the state took control of it. Christianity had once been a free-reigning religion, and now it was a state religion, and it changed drastically. So a lot of the practices and cultural aspects of the original Christian faith have been lost to time because they went extinct, because those who practiced them would have been persecuted. So we've looked at the way in which Rome has affected it and the way in which the Gospels probably aren't very accurate. Here's another thing. Why is it that no historians from Rome or Judea at the time of Jesus' supposed lifetime actually wrote about him? The first accounts come from the 60s AD, 30 years after he supposedly died. Why? The two most likely explanations are, number one, he never existed. But we do have accounts from later, so let's just assume he existed. The most likely way to explain why Jesus isn't written about until long after he died is that he wasn't as noteworthy as the Gospels, etc., make us believe. That is, that the historical Jesus was most likely a mortal and a teacher. Obviously, I don't personally believe in God, so I couldn't say he was the Son of God. But even going from a religious perspective, that doesn't, even assuming that the God of the Christians is real, that doesn't prove Jesus is the Son of God, because the early Christians were having difficulty putting their heads around that concept too. There has never been a unanimous agreement among Christians, and even to this day there are more liberal Christian groups which say no, Jesus was not a Messiah or the Son of God, Jesus was essentially a prophet. There are plenty of groups who believe that. So what you have is you have a lot of religious people passing him off, oh, of course he's the Son of God, blah, blah, blah. But why, if he was so noteworthy, did nobody in the area at the time of his life write about him? Why aren't there accounts from 0 to 33 AD? All the books about him are written later. What seems to have happened is that the story of Jesus was conglomerated and compounded over time by oral historical accounts and by a whitewashing of the events surrounding his life by those who were proselytizing and evangelizing the communities in Judea at the time. So the religion took off because people were spreading stories about Jesus which never actually happened. All of this stuff about fed 5,000 people with a few fish, and he rose from the dead, and he walked on water. What do all of these things have in common? Very few people were even possible witnesses. When he supposedly walked on water, the only people that were supposedly with him were the disciples. So since we know the disciples did not write the stories about Jesus in the Gospels, we know that for a fact. We know that people who were physically with Jesus during his life did not write these stories. So who recorded the event? The only people who even knew about it were the 12 disciples, most of which would have been dead by that time. Many of which probably weren't even literate. So who wrote the story, and on what information were they deriving it? They were deriving it from basically the thing which gives Islam the hadiths, the traditions, gives Christianity most of the New Testament. They are orally transmitted traditions about Jesus without any real evidence that they ever happened. So all of these wonderful proverbs and stories about Jesus' lifetime probably are not rooted in fact, they're rooted in fancy. But Christians will cry left and right if you claim this and say, well, the Bible is the Word of God, so it has to be right, but you point out to them, what if it's the Word of man? And if you look historically at the Bible, that's what seems to be the case. Now, that just makes sense to those of us who use logic and rationality. Apparently less so to Christians. But if you look at the historical context, you can see quite plainly, it seems as though Jesus, the man behind the myth, was drastically different from the reports in the New Testament about what he supposedly did. All these wonderful healings and curings he did, why, if he was going around all of Israel, preaching and healing people and doing all these miracles, why did not one person think to write down a record of what was happening? We have no accounts from Judean historians and no accounts from Roman historians that were in the area during his lifetime. There were people traversing those areas. They would have heard about it if he had actually been doing these things. Somebody would have spread the word, oh, that dude just walked on water. No, he just fed 5,000 people with a few fish and a loaf of bread. He can heal lepers. He can talk to God. He can do all these wonderful things. Everybody in the area would have known about him almost instantly. Virtually everybody would have known about him. They would have told the Roman historians, oh, well, tell me about what's going on here. Somebody would have witnessed what he was doing and written a record of it. But the first recorded instance in Roman history or Jewish history is from 3 or 4 decades after he died. That sounds fishy to me. Why would they wait that long? At the very least, they wouldn't have waited that long. It would have been 2 or 3 years, because by that time there were enough Christians. They were still being persecuted, but then so were the Jews. And the Christians will say, oh, well, it was because they were being persecuted. The Romans burned all the copies of all the books they didn't like. They were persecuting the Jews too. There's plenty of surviving accounts of the Old Testament from thousands of years ago. There's plenty of surviving record of the Jewish traditional culture. Why is there none from Christianity until 40 years after Jesus supposedly died? The group had grown to quite a size by that time. They were being persecuted, but they still existed. There were still hidden grottos and temples all over the place where they were worshipping. So why didn't they have at least a few written... And also, we would know if a Roman historian had said something about it, which is actually more likely than a Jewish historian doing it, because they had historians wandering around the desert all the time. Why wouldn't the Roman historians' accounts be preserved as Roman records? Of course they would. At the very least in the form of a story or fable. They'd probably have to add some disclaimer, oh, well, these are just fables. The only way in which it's preserved is, ironically, by Rome itself at a later date, after Constantine adopts it. But think about it like that. Why wouldn't there be accounts from his own lifetime if he actually did all the things which he supposedly did? Of course there would. And why is it that the Gospels were written so much later, and all these books that the Christians always talk about, oh, those disciples wrote all these books. No, they didn't. His disciples were dead by the time Mark or Matthew were written. They were all gone. They all died. All this, oh, well, Paul wrote this, and Peter wrote this, and Matthew wrote this. No, they didn't. Probably none of these people wrote a book in their lives. So why even consider the religion valid and accurate? You know, if it gives you happiness and hope, go ahead. But learn about the religion and the historical impact of that religion, and don't delude yourselves into believing something that isn't true. Because it is not factual or accurate to say that Jesus did all these things when there's no record from the time of his life that he actually did them. Even if you look at some of the texts banned from the Bible, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, again, written 2 centuries after he died. Who did the accounts come from? We don't know. Peace.